Okay, so I keep on saying okay. So the lecture today will be on phosphorus. So we covered the nitrogen cycle on Tuesday, and we're just going to do phosphorus now. So phosphorus is another key nutrient element. Okay, so there it is. P, got a mass of 31. Element number 15. This is stuff which is kind of irrelevant. But it does form this molecule here, phosphate ion, so that's a phosphorus in the middle surrounded by lots of oxygens. And that is really important for being a nutrient, because life needs phosphorus. So it forms a key part of things like DNA. So you see the phosphorus atoms in DNA are the yellow ones here. The nitrogen are the blue, so you see phosphorus and nitrogen are key for DNA. You don't have those, you get no DNA, you get no life, which would be sad. It also forms the end of the molecules that make up all of your cells. So without phosphorus you wouldn't have cell walls, which would be unfortunate, because you just collapse into kind of like a jelly-like substance, which would be very, very, very bad. And these, just to show these minerals down here on the bottom, right, left, well, it doesn't really matter. This is the mineral apatite. Okay, which is a calcium phosphate mineral, and this is basically the bulk of phosphate in rocks is in this mineral form apatite. Okay, and that's really important because unlike the nitrogen cycle, most of the phosphorus is in rocks. Okay, and that makes the cycling of phosphorus difficult, different and difficult, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Okay, so there are some processes that are similar to the nitrogen cycle, and there are some processes which are very different. Okay, so we're going to introduce it. We're going to go through the land and the ocean, very much like we did for the nitrogen cycle, and then we're going to maybe talk about a little bit how we've been altering stuff. Okay, so this is some text which kind of summarises kind of what I've just said for that first slide. So it's a really important component, phosphorus, for kind of lots of parts of life. Okay, so it's really important for DNA. It's really important in these two molecules, adenosine triphosphate and adenosine diphosphate. Okay, so these are two molecules that that exist in every cell, in almost every organism. Let's say every organism. And these molecules are responsible for the transfer of energy around cells. So the difference between the two molecules is one has 3 phosphate groups, one has 2 phosphate groups, and just adding one phosphate on, taking off, takes up energy, and basically you can store chemical potential energy in these molecules, and that molecule can then move around the cell, and that chemical potential energy can be used somewhere else. So they're essentially a little bit like little batteries within all cells. Okay, so if we don't have enough phosphorus to add another phosphorus onto our ADP to make ATP, that means the cells can't do stuff. Okay, so they can't use energy. Okay, so having enough phosphorus is really important for that. It's also important for things like bones, teeth, and shells. Okay, so our bones are made of a mineral called calcium hydroxyapatite. So it's very similar to the apatite in rocks. Okay, so we're kind of made of rocks, which is kind of cool if you're a geologist. But yeah, so without phosphorus, the kind of large macro fauna like us would be very difficult to exist. Okay, so without it, it limits kind of the amount of biology that can happen. Okay, so that's a really key point. So it's kind of with all nutrients. If you run out of any of these key elements, if you run out of nitrogen, okay, stuff stops. You can't grow any more plants or animals. If you run out of phosphorus, likewise. Okay, so if you run out of a nutrient, that limits the amount of biological activity that can happen. Okay, so that's deleted that for people that. So this is just to look at some of those stocks again. So some of the forms of phosphorus in this. So in the atmosphere, kind of dust is the key form of phosphorus in the atmosphere. In aqueous environments, so in the ocean, and in soils, and in rivers, we have these phosphate forms. Okay, so this is a phosphorus surrounded by kind of 4 oxygens, and there are basically 4 slightly different flavours of that phosphorus phosphate ion. There's a phosphate ion that's just this, okay, with oxygen surrounding the phosphorus, and that's got a charge of -3. And then if you add a hydrogen on, so the yellow balls there are hydrogen atoms, you add those hydrogen on and you get hydrogen phosphate, dihydrogen phosphate, and the top one is not trihydrogen phosphate, it's phosphoric acid. Okay, but the charge of the different, and you can see, just like with the carbonate system, with carbonate, bicarbonate, and CO2, or carbonate, bicarbonate, and carbonic acid, the version of this that you get is dependent on the pH of the solution. Okay, so if you've got a very, very acidic solution, you end up with mostly phosphoric acid. Okay, if you have a very, very basic solution, you end up with mostly phosphate ions. Okay. Yeah, so you get phosphate in teeth and phosphate in rocks. Those are the other things to be. Okay, so these are the same kind of things written out in words. So the atmosphere is really not a huge source of phosphorus, okay? But you can move rocks around in the atmosphere. Okay, so if you erode a rock, you make some rock dust, and you blow that from one environment, maybe has lots of rocks, into another environment, like the ocean. Okay, so it turns out that that is a significant source of phosphorus to places in the ocean that's a long, long way from land. So although there's not a lot of it, the dust-borne phosphorus is kind of slightly important. The hydrosphere, so aqueous environments, has these different forms of the phosphate ion, depending on pH. And then the biosphere stuff is held up in organic matter, so within some of these molecules within cells which have phosphorus in them, like the cell walls, the phosphobilipid layers in cells. And then you've got this huge stock in the lithosphere that's mostly apatite and some of these other things called phosphorites. So phosphorite is essentially fossilized animal poo. Okay. Okay. So these are just descriptions of those kind of stocks. So you can see the largest stock down here is 4 times 10 to the 9 teragrams of phosphorus. So that's a huge stock in sediments. We have some in land plants, some in soils. We've got mining. Okay, so our activity is producing basically ground up bits of rock. So that's a source of phosphorus. And then we have phosphates dissolved in the ocean. So these dissolved phosphorus ions surrounded by oxygens. And just like with nitrogen, there's this cycling between kind of the biosphere and soils, keeping on reusing kind of phosphorus. And we'll come back to that. Okay, so this is an example of a phosphorus mine in Togo. Not quite sure what Togo is, but they have phosphate mines there. So it's a really big industrial activity. And it's important because it's the only way that we can get this important key nutrient. Okay, so if we wanted to grow some barley in like fields in Scotland to make whiskey, which is kind of nice. Not very ethically carbon kind of neutral, but anyway. We want to grow some barley. We might make some nitrogen fertilizer. We can make that out of the atmosphere. Okay, so we can make and that's a limitless supply of nitrogen, right? The atmosphere is kind of full. But that barley won't grow if we don't have a source of phosphorus. Okay? So there might be enough phosphorus in the soil, but eventually that might be depleted if we have lots of industrial farming. So the only other source of phosphate for agriculture is going to places like Togo and digging a massive hole. Okay? So ultimately, one of the things that limits the amount of global agriculture that we can do is activities like this. Okay? Digging massive holes in the ground and digging up deposits that are rich in phosphorus, okay? And then trying to kind of chemically isolate that and making fertilizer out of it. Okay, so that's the kind of the industrial way we do it. If you think in the natural cycle, okay, so that the natural equivalent of mining, okay, is the weathering of rocks. Okay, so this is these are, I can't remember where this is actually, but these are some basalts. And on top of the basalts you can see there's some vegetation, and you might just be able to make out there's some red soil up there. Okay, and what's happening is the soil is forming, and that's weathering down these rocks underneath, and that means that the phosphorus in the rocks is now incorporated into the soil kind of on top of those rocks. So we're taking phosphorus out of this reservoir, the rock reservoir, and we're putting it into the soil reservoir, okay, where it can be used by plants. Okay? So weathering, okay, particularly chemical weathering of rocks that contain phosphorus, which is kind of almost all rocks, contain a little bit of phosphorus they have. Although most of the phosphorus is in these tiny apatite crystals, which make up a very small proportion of rocks, quite a lot of rocks have at least some apatite in them. If they don't have apatite, for instance, if these are volcanic rocks, they'll have a lot of volcanic glass in them, okay? And that volcanic glass will have some phosphorus in it, and when that weathers, it will release it into the environment. And in this case, our soil, I think it's a laterite soil, but that doesn't really matter. But you can see it's very red, okay? There's lots of iron oxides in that soil, and that will become important later on. So remember that the soil has lots of iron oxides in them. Okay, so this is this weathering reaction. So we're taking mineral forms. Okay, so this calcium phosphate mineral. Okay, sometimes it has OH groups on it. Sometimes it has fluorine groups on it, or chlorine. So it's actually quite a resistant mineral to weathering. And then we do some chemical weathering to that. So we might add carbonic acid. Okay, and that would help dissolve that mineral. Okay, and it would release these ions, these phosphate ions. Now, the problem when you do that is that because these are ionic forms of the phosphorus, okay, that makes them quite soluble in water. Okay, which is good in one way because that means that plants can use it, they can uptake that phosphate into their roots. Okay. But if it's dissolved in water, and that water starts running off the land into rivers and into the sea, that means we lose it out of the environment. Okay? So we don't want that to happen. Well, if you're the ocean, you want that to happen. But if you're trying to kind of grow plants on land, all your nutrients washing away into the sea is not such a great idea. So we do lose some of the products of this weathering. We do lose them into the ocean. And it turns out that quite a lot of them get kind of stuck onto these iron oxide minerals. We'll just go and have a look at what that means. So, depending on the pH of the fluid, the soil water or the river water, something like that, if you've got a very, very low pH, it turns out that the phosphorus wants to be more in this dihydrogen phosphate form. Okay, and it also wants to stick on to iron oxide minerals. So if you've got lots of iron oxide minerals, okay, the phosphate will stick onto the surface of those minerals. Okay, that means that it's no longer in solution, so it can't be washed away. Okay, which is good, keep it in the environment. But it does also mean that because it's stuck onto the surface of an iron oxide mineral, it can't be used by a plant. Okay, which is kind of annoying if you're a plant. But it does at least mean it stayed in the local kind of system. Okay. Now, at very, very high pHs, okay, so if we get on to 8 or 9 or something like that, we actually start to reprecipitate some of these calcium phosphate minerals. Okay, so you don't precipitate apatite, but minerals similar to that. And that means that if you start to precipitate phosphates into these calcium phosphate minerals, that means they can't be washed away, but they can't be used by life either. Okay, so there's this kind of sweet spot in the middle around pH 6 or 7, where, so we can see on this graph here that at low pH, most of the phosphorus is held up in these iron oxides. Okay, and there's only a tiny small amount available. Okay, and as you move into pH of 6, there's still actually not much of the total phosphorus is available to be used by life, but you're looking at maybe 2 or 3 times as much available at this pH than at high pH. So the pH of the soil is really important for determining how much of the phosphorus that you've weathered into the environment you can actually use. Okay, so that's the kind of a double-edged sword in that there might not be a lot available, but it does at least mean that all this really valuable phosphorus can't be washed away into rivers and into the ocean. Slide. Is that as you go from the calcium phosphate to calcium hydrogen phosphate to calcium diphosphate, it makes those minerals are differently soluble. Okay, so at high pH you have more of this kind of calcium phosphate forming, which is a more insoluble mineral than calcium dihydrogen phosphate. Okay, so as you change the pH, if you make the pH higher and higher and higher, so more alkaline, you start to form more and more of these more insoluble calcium phosphates. Okay, and that, once again, that locks away the phosphorus, stops it being available for life. Okay, so we've got this problem that with the phosphorus cycle, we really need phosphorus. It's a key biolimiting element, okay? But we can't make it, okay? Like we can make, well, we can't make the phosphorus, we can't make the nitrogen, but we can make nitrate, okay, by doing nitrogen fixation. But we can't make phosphate out of the atmosphere or out of dissolved gaseous phosphorus. Okay, we have to weather the rocks. And as soon as we weather it, we lose 90% of it. Okay, it goes into these forms, these iron oxides and these calcium phosphates that life can't use. So leaving it only a very small amount that's available. Okay. So what we need to do is we need to think of ways that life can kind of keep that phosphorus available. And one of them is if you've got lots of organic acid. Okay, so if you've got lots of kind of partially broken down organic matter, okay, the phosphorus can be associated with that. Okay, so it can kind of bind onto that instead of the iron oxides and the calcium oxides. So that means that it can be made available later on as that organic matter breaks down. Okay? And there is this other factor is that although we've lost most of the phosphorus, we've lost it to these iron oxides and these calcium phosphates, it's not all like bad news. Because although it's not immediately bioavailable, okay, it's a lot easier to get it back out of those things, to get it back out of the iron oxides, than it is to weather some more apatite. Okay, because apatite's a mineral in a rock that's quite hard to weather. Okay, so the next diagram is so we've got this kind of store here of phosphate that's bound up in soils, either in iron oxides or in calcium phosphates, that's not totally available, okay, but it's kind of like in reserve. So if we run out of the available phosphorus, we might be able to access that hidden away store. Okay. Okay, and these are just saying that fluxes that the weathering flux, 60 kind of teragrams per year, and mining is a significant component of that, but and most of it into the sea. Okay. So yeah, so this is the flux. So once we've got the phosphate in the usable form, some of it can be washed into the sea and lost from the system. Okay, so if you're looking at the terrestrial ecosystem, that flux is bad, and half of that is washed into the sea. Okay, so to conclude the land cycle, okay, the main source is weathering of rocks. Okay, and once we've weathered it, it's really hard to keep it usable. Okay, and whether it's usable or not is really dependent on pH. Okay, so this is a slightly better way of showing that. So we start out with loads and loads of phosphorus that's held up in rocks over here in apatite grains. Okay, we do some weathering, and that forms soluble phosphate. Okay, now as soon as that's available, it'll either be used by plants, okay, and taken up into the biosphere, or much more likely is that we'll actually take some of this phosphorus and then hide it away in either iron oxides or calcium phosphates. Okay? So we've got this kind of secondary store of phosphorus over here. Now, if we subtly change the pH of the soil, okay, we will take some of this unavailable phosphorus and make it available again. So it's kind of like we've got this partially available phosphorus kind of in reserve, okay, that can then be in the soluble form and used by life. And just like within the nitrogen cycle, okay, we don't use that phosphorus once. Okay, so it gets taken up into plants, okay, plants get eaten by animals or die directly, and that organic matter then decays, okay, which is kind of essentially like dissolving it again, and that releases the phosphorus back into the environment, okay, where it can either be used again by a plant, or it can be kind of held away in this kind of reserve of, I guess sometimes it's called occluded forms, but that's a bit kind of like scientific wording, but these kind of like slightly hidden forms of phosphorus. Okay, so these iron oxides and calcium phosphates. Okay, and then ultimately, at some time, some of this phosphorus is going to be dissolved, and it will make its way into rivers and be lost from the system. Okay, so we're going to now talk about the ocean cycle. Okay, so the ocean cycle, you don't really have much weathering going on in the actual ocean. Okay, but what we do have is we have the products of weathering on land, both the natural weathering of rocks and also the weathering of mining products. Okay, which is essentially think of it as the runoff from farmers' fields. There's lots of phosphorus in it. That makes its way into the ocean. Okay, and that river runoff, okay, is the major source of phosphorus to the ocean. Okay, and you'll notice that because a significant portion of that is anthropogenic in origin, okay, this has vastly increased over the kind of the agricultural revolution. Okay, so there also is this dust transport term. So there is a small amount of dust that gets kind of like blown up from the land and introduced into the ocean. So if you're looking at the whole ocean, it's quite a small component, okay? But you can only get this river flux, okay, where you have rivers, okay? In places that are a long way from rivers, like the middle of the Pacific Ocean or the Southern Ocean, this transport of nutrients by dust is really important, okay? And it's not necessarily you're bringing in particles of apatite necessarily. But remember that the phosphorus, when it's in a soil, it's quite a lot of it might be stuck onto iron oxides. Okay, and iron oxides are quite a common coating on minerals. Okay, particles in the kind of the soil environment. So most of the phosphorus is kind of like riding kind of like shotgun on a dust particle strapped onto an iron oxide out into the ocean. Okay. So when it gets into the ocean, you don't need to dissolve the whole dust particle. You just need to change the pH enough so the phosphorus desorbs from the iron oxide. Okay, you don't even need to dissolve the iron oxide to release the phosphorus. Okay, so this is going into a little bit of chemistry now. So all of that phosphorus that gets coming down the river, okay, river's got a pH of about 7. Usually it's actually a little bit lower than that. But the ocean has got a pH of 8. Okay? And it's got a pH of 8 because it's basically got lots of carbonate in it. So when the phosphorus gets into the ocean, the pH changes from this kind of value around 7, where you're in that kind of almost in that sweet spot of the phosphorus being dissolved. Okay? If you go into a pH of 8, you then move into this region where the phosphate ions don't want to be in solution anymore. Okay, so as soon as your river hits the ocean, you lose almost all of it. Okay? Okay, as it basically precipitates out as soon as it hits the ocean. That's these calcium phosphates. So that's annoying. So it turns out of that 21 teragrams a year of phosphorus that's entering the ocean, we only get 19. Oh, sorry, we only get 2. 19 is lost. Okay. So one of the things that's going to happen with global warming and climate change and all this kind of stuff is we're putting loads of CO2 into the atmosphere, okay, which is bad. And those of you've done you've all done my practical for this carbon dioxide, right? So you should know that CO2 is reducing the pH of the ocean. Okay, so lowering the pH of the ocean is going to make the pH lower. Okay, that's a really stupid thing to say. Obviously, it's going to make it lower. Okay, so that's going to make this. It's not going to push it from this kind of sweet spot so much. Okay, so less of the phosphate when it hits the ocean is going to precipitate out. So even if we do nothing if we keep our agriculture the same, just by putting CO2 into the atmosphere, we're changing the flux of usable phosphorus into the ocean. Okay, so it's just kind of so you can see now how, almost ignoring the biology part of the carbon cycle, okay, how the carbon cycle is linked and controls the phosphorus cycle. Okay? I mean, the carbon cycle controls the phosphorus cycle in a more fundamental way in that life is really important for moving the phosphorus between kind of out of the inorganic phase into the organic phase. You couldn't do that without carbon. But there is this kind of quite neat little interaction here between ocean acidification and the availability of nutrients. Okay? Okay, so this is that kind of like diagrammatic thing. So of this huge flux into the ocean, we actually only get kind of 2 teragrams a year out into the ocean proper, which is kind of quite neat because that means this dust input into the ocean is starting to become more significant. Okay? But of course we will lose some of that as well when that goes into the ocean because the pH there will change as well. Okay, so we've got these really small fluxes of phosphate to the ocean. So 2 teragrams a year from the land, 1 teragram a year from the ocean. Okay, but if you look at the requirement, so we did this for nitrogen. So this is this thing called this Redfield ratio. So this is for every 106 carbon atoms that algae use up in the ocean. Every time primary productivity happens, this is you're taking CO2 dissolved out of the water and forming organic matter. So for every 106 carbon atoms, you need 16 nitrogen atoms. Okay. You also need 1 phosphorus atom, and this is kind of like the average ratio that the ocean takes up carbon, and so that organisms in the ocean take up carbon and nutrients. Okay. On land, it's much more variable. Okay. But bizarrely in the ocean, almost everywhere you go, you get things taken up at this ratio, where you need 1 phosphorus atom for every 106 carbon atoms. We'll do more about that in oceanography if you do that course. We can go through and say from the same arguments that we did with the nitrogen, if we have 60 gigatons of carbon a year is taken up by primary productivity. How much phosphorus do you need for that? It turns out you need 1,000 teragrams of phosphorus, okay, every year to sustain the primary productivity, okay. And you can see that the fluxes per year, okay, is 3, okay. So 3 is definitely not equal to 1,000, okay. And the reason why we can sustain that huge kind of amount of primary productivity with such a small amount of phosphorus is exactly the same reason for nitrogen. Okay, we're internally recycling it within the ocean. Okay, so these are profiles of phosphorus against depth, and the form of this profile is almost identical to the form of the profile for nitrogen. Okay, there will be some subtle differences because for nitrogen, for instance, you can lose nitrate to denitrification, okay, which you should remember. But the main process that's going on here is in the surface ocean, at the top up there, life happens, okay, and it kind of takes up nutrients and carbon and forms organic matter, that's rich in nitrogen, phosphorus and carbon, and then that organic matter gets eaten by larger organisms or just sinks down into the deep ocean in the form of like small bits of sinking plant or in kind of fecal pellets. And that exports nutrients from the surface oceans. That means that the surface ocean is depleted in the concentration, whereas the deep ocean, okay, as this organic matter rains down through the deep ocean, it kind of breaks apart and releases those nutrients back out again. Okay? And you can see the longer the water's been down there, so going around on this conveyor of ocean circulation, okay, so younger water that's been isolated from the surface less long, like the Atlantic, has got a lower concentration than the Pacific and Indian Oceans, because they've been accumulating organic matter for longer. Okay? So whenever this deep water, which is really rich in nutrients, upwells into the surface, okay, that supplies nutrients again to the ocean, to the surface ocean where it can be used. Okay? So we basically can have this extra source of nutrients, phosphate and nitrogen, to the surface ocean from the deep ocean. Okay? And the deep ocean is very, very big compared to the surface ocean, so it can supply lots and lots and lots of nutrients. Okay, and you can kind of see that here. So this is a map of Africa, or map of the ocean around Africa, with the concentration of phosphate. Okay, and you can see in the regions where we have water that's coming from the deep ocean to the surface, so around Namibia, around the coast of West Africa and the Arabian Peninsula there, you have a lot of upwelling. Okay, so this supplies lots of nutrients to the surface ocean, and these regions support large kind of amounts of biological productivity. Okay, so I mean, if you want to go whale watching, I mean, going off Cape Town over here is great because there's loads and loads of biological activity going along, loads and loads of plankton being produced, loads of fish, loads of seals, loads of whales, and that kind of stuff, which is nice to see if you're over there. Okay, so this is this concept of internal cycling. Okay, so we so this is this upwelling term. Sorry, so that upwelling term supplies some phosphorus, but it's not supplying the total amount. Okay, so we've got the surface ocean. Think of that as one box. Okay, and then we're supplying into that box some phosphorus from rivers, some phosphorus from dust, and some phosphorus from underneath. Okay, but still it doesn't explain everything. Okay. Okay, so this concept of internal cycling, and I kind of mentioned that in terms of recycling phosphorus from the deep ocean up to the surface. Okay, but you can also recycle the phosphorus just within the surface layer. Okay, so internal cycling kind of has two very similar meanings, which is kind of annoying, in that if you're thinking about the ocean as a whole, okay, most people think of internal cycling as the recycling of deep phosphorus that's come from the deep ocean as being upwelled to the surface. But just within the surface layer of the ocean, you can also get recycling where kind of plants grow, and then they get eaten, and that organic matter gets respired, and the fish die, and they release that phosphorus back into the water as they decay. If they release it back into the water before they decay faster than that organic matter is sinking through the water column, okay, then it's essentially internally cycles just within the surface layer. Okay? So if you can make that internal cycling process more efficient, that happens much faster than putting it down into the deep ocean where it can be stored for a very long time and then brought back up again. Okay? So there are two kind of layers of internal cycling. And this is true of the nitrogen cycle as well as the phosphorus cycle, that you have internal cycling within the surface layer, okay, but also longer, slower rate cycling within the surface, between the surface and the deep ocean. Okay, so think about the. This is from Finding Nemo. I know I just love the seagulls in Finding Nemo. So so the outputs to the system. So we've got this phosphorus in the ocean. So we've got these sources coming in. So there must be some, I think, removing phosphorus from the ocean. Okay, and that's partially in organic sediments at the bottom of the ocean. I should figure out where to stop me doing that. It's really distracting, isn't it? But it turns out that one of the main fluxes of phosphorus out of the ocean is actually in bird shit. Okay? So birds, they eat fish out of the ocean, okay, and then they fly over the land, and then they poop it out, right? And that creates deposits on rocks, okay, this white stuff, okay, and that is super rich in phosphorus. Okay? So that kind of almost completes the cycle of phosphorus in terms of these. I mean, if you get huge deposits of this this material building up, okay, that can lead to the formation of kind of large, essentially thicknesses of fossil poo, okay, and that is actually one of the sources that when we first kind of started using not so much synthetic but kind of fertilizers for agriculture, okay, we had to go out to kind of like ocean islands, because it was actually one of the reasons for kind of the British colonial expansion into the Pacific and Indian Oceans was to go to islands and dig up this bird crap and ship it back to the UK and just put it on fields. Okay? Which is also why it says mine everywhere, because I'm thinking it's also not just everything's mine, mine, mine. They're actually standing on a phosphate mine. Okay? That's just really bad. But anyway, so that kind of does complete the the phosphate cycle in terms of the ultimate outputs from the ocean is the building up of these phosphate-rich organic deposits. And these can be kind of bird crap, or they can be organic-rich sediments, okay? Because any organic matter will have some phosphate kind of in it as well. So that's what forms quite a lot of the larger kind of phosphate mines. Okay, so this is this output flux here. So you can kind of see that the output flux is kind of 2, which kind of matches the input flux of 1 and the pre-industrial river flux. So the river flux would have been probably about 10 before we started mining on land. So 1 and kind of like the river influx is now 2 because you lose most of it. So if you halve what you were putting in before, then you're getting 1 out. So 1 and 1 kind of makes 2. So that's kind of the balance of the system. So we can see now that the ocean is now very far out of its natural kind of balance, in that we're adding in kind of a third. We're adding in 50% more than is kind of the natural state. Okay, and this term here hasn't quite caught up. Okay, so although we're putting in more, we're not taking out at the same rate as we're putting in yet. So over time, this flux may increase, but over the kind of the residence time of phosphate in the ocean, it will respond. Okay, so to conclude, the ocean cycle, there's a really small amount of phosphorus from the atmosphere, and a very small amount of the stuff that we put in the ocean actually makes it out of the estuary. Okay, so as soon as the pH of the water changes, that phosphorus gets precipitated away into stuff we can't use, which leaves us with a very small flux into the ocean. And to support the amount of primary productivity, we need to make really efficient use of the phosphate that we put in. Okay? Because in the ocean, for nitrogen, you can do nitrogen fixation. So if you run out of nitrogen, then you can just start to do nitrogen fixation, and that will create more useful nitrate. But you can't do that for phosphorus, so you have to really, really efficiently recycle it, either within the surface layer or down through the deep ocean. Okay, and the ultimate output is sediments of either organic matter or bird. Okay, so the ways that we've altered that is we've basically increased the fluxes into the ocean. Okay, and we've increased those by increasing the amount of runoff from land. Okay, and that's through deforestation, which increases erosion, so that increases chemical weathering, with more offland. We're actively mining the stuff, okay, and deliberately putting it on the land where it can be washed into the oceans. Actually, all of our kind of untreated sewage waste, that's just a flux of organic matter that's rich in phosphorus. Okay, so that's essentially just like adding fertilizer to the ocean as well. And we also haven't written it up on this slide, but we also have this impact of ocean acidification. So the more acid the ocean's getting because of rising CO2 means the less phosphorus we're losing, okay, when it enters the ocean. Okay, and the problem with that is that we're adding all of these nutrients to the ocean, which is kind of great, increase the productivity of oceans, but we're adding them at really like localized sites. We're adding them at river mouths. Okay, and that means that we're basically creating very small local areas where there are too many nutrients. Okay, which means that we'll have too much biological productivity. Okay, which means that there'll be lots and lots of algae forming, which is kind of great for sequestering CO2 out of the atmosphere, but that algae then dies and uses up all of the oxygen in the water, okay, as it decays. You use up all the oxygen, then all of the nice tasty macrofauna like fish, they die. We also start the denitrification process. So by increasing the phosphorus cycle, we impact the uptake of CO2 into the atmosphere. We also change the nitrogen cycle because we've used up all of the oxygen because of this eutrophication process. So you can see how the cycles are kind of linked together. Okay, you can't just see one in isolation. Okay, and this is kind of a nice example of this. So this is, I think I've written it down here, Lake 226, experimental lakes area, Lake 226. So this is a place in Canada where the Canadian government said to some scientists, here are some lakes, do some science. And because Canada's really, really big, okay, they can have at least 226 of their lakes that nobody really cares about. You can do whatever you want scientifically. And what they did was this experiment where they had this lake which was basically divided into two parts by a curtain. Okay? So you isolated the two parts of the lake. And in one side of the lake, this side, they put a whole bunch of nitrate and phosphate. Okay? You can see the effect that that's had. Okay? You had this big algal bloom. Okay? That reduced the oxygen in the water by all that algae dying. Okay? Super bad. Okay? For the environment of that lake. In the other side of the lake, they just added nitrate. So it's a fertilizer, dump loads of nitrogen, and nothing happened. And it didn't happen because they didn't add both of the nutrients. So you need both the nitrogen and the phosphate to have this algal bloom. Okay? So the cycling of nitrogen and phosphate, both of them together, are critical for having these algal blooms for. Okay, so to summarise the whole jobbing, sedimentary cycle is really important because there's no atmospheric cycle for phosphorus. The main flux of phosphorus into the ocean is by rivers, and it's really, really pH dependent whether that phosphorus is usable or not. Okay, and the key difference between the phosphate and the nitrogen cycle is this nitrogen fixation. So the nitrogen cycle, if the environment runs out of nitrate, there's no more nitrogen nutrients around. Okay, there are organisms which can make it out of the atmosphere or out of the dissolved gas. Okay, but you can't do that with phosphorus, which is why the internal cycling is so important. Okay, so that's the end of that lecture. So I'll just stop this.